Hello, Criminal Justice Administration students. Welcome to the course as we enter week 3. This week we completed chapter 2 and looked at a wide variety of topics such as management styles, which might be best for being effective, the topic of bureaucracy, which is a very important topic in the public sector, which most criminal justice agencies are part of. We also looked at communications theory, the evolution of management theory from the early days of scientific theory through the Hawthorne effect to the human relations school of management to new and more contemporary leadership theories, which are more widely used today. I just want you to make sure that you pay attention to the key terms and concepts at the end of chapter 2 and be sure you understand them, because all of them could be part of your upcoming unit test. And speaking of your unit test, as we start chapter 3 of the textbook, please be aware that at the end of chapter 3, late next week, you will have a unit test which covers the topics in chapter 1, 2, and 3. Right now, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we're going to cover in chapter 3. Chapter 3 is more of a focus on our employment laws and our employment relationship when we work in the public sector and in criminal justice and in employment generally. There are many laws that affect the employment relationship between management and labor, between individuals, and a variety of practices that may or may not be allowed in the hiring, day-to-day oversight, promotion, and firing of people. We want to look at some of these laws because they are very important in your work in the public sector, and particularly in your work in criminal justice. Now, chapter 3 is the chapter that covers this topic in the Peak Text 8th edition. But if you happen to have the 7th edition, you're really looking at the topic in chapter 13. Pretty much it covers the same information. So let's consider just a few of the things that are key in chapter 3. First of all, we are going to be talking about the law. And when we're talking about the law, we're talking about what can and can't be done in the workplace under the law. You'll find at the end of the chapter there are a number of key terms which are set up alphabetically. In the beginning of the chapter, however, they're set up more logically. So some of the things that will be covered are the issues under the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Family Medical Leave Act, the Hatch Act, and such things as affirmative action, the restrictions on affirmative action that came about due to court decisions related to reverse discrimination, and the very timely topic of workplace harassment, which can take the form both of sexual harassment and general harassment in the workplace for a variety of things such as your race, your religion, other things that may make you unique but cannot be restricted under the law. So let's first consider the list of laws that shows up on in chapter 3 on page 51, and they are 50 and 51. Those are important laws to be aware of. The Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, is a law that affects the labor and rights of individual employees both in the public sector and the private sector. It has been adopted to private sector employees, but it contains special provisions for those in law enforcement and firefighters. Then there's also mention of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and later amendments. That's a very important act in terms of protecting people from discrimination and ensuring that the hiring and qualification process for getting a job and being promoted for a job is based on some bona fide occupational qualification, which simply means that this is really a qualification that you need, not that you prefer, that you can prove that you need. So, for example, in law enforcement for many years, there was a very restrictive height requirement of approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall for most people to enter law enforcement or firefighting. What group of people? It has a lot of members who are under 5'4", and I'm one of them. Obviously, it's women. So just having that, you have to prove that they need to have that height, have that reach, that height qualifies or provides a certain strength. And over time, it's been determined that such a height requirement is really an unnecessary restriction and does not stand up under the law as a pre-qualification for entering the field of law enforcement, firefighting, or other criminal justice positions. Another important law that involves equal pay for equal work. It is also an important law that protects women because primarily the group that was paid less over time for a variety of reasons, especially in the past when the woman was considered secondary earner in a family and men were considered primary, is that they would make up different job titles for the same work and pay women in the job title lower and men in the job title higher. That has pretty much gone, but there still are issues of ensuring that men and women who enter the same job and do the same work are on an equal footing. Along with the Equal Pay Act, there are other restrictions. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act restricts keeping women out of jobs because they may have to take a pregnancy leave, and there are related things that you want to read about. Age discrimination is an interesting subject in the criminal justice field because there are age restrictions. For example, the state police have a limit on how old you can be to be hired and generally have an early retirement age. And generally speaking, there are physical qualifications that go along with age that have stood up as appropriate. But in general, just letting someone go because they're older or just hiring someone because they're younger or older is not allowed under the Age Discrimination Act. Another important act to consider is the American with Disabilities Act, the ADA. This has tremendously and dramatically changed the employment scene for people with disabilities and the educational opportunities for people with disabilities. And there have to be accommodations made under the law for people with a variety of needs. And then there are also some constitutional rights that are protected under Section 1983 of Title 42 of the U.S. Code of 1983, and that they have more to do with civil rights. There's a lot in here also about legal decisions that have affected criminal justice. For a long time, in the 1970s and 1980s, there was an attempt to affirmatively hire people who had been left out of the employment opportunity over time, such as people of minority races. And they used a tool called affirmative action, and affirmative action allowed people that were from minority groups to move up into opportunities for jobs as one of the technical approaches to try and create a more diverse workforce. But over time, that became a question of rights under the Constitution, equal rights under the Constitution, and there were a number of reverse discrimination cases that were settled in favor of white men being treated the same as women and minorities under the Equal Protection Act of the Constitution. So reverse discrimination kind of put a real damper on the affirmative action movement. Other topics that you're going to look at are safety in the workplace, OSHA laws that protect at the federal and state level, and then certain restrictions in criminal justice, things such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. Can there be restrictions on that? In fact, yes, there can, and I want you to read about that in the chapter. Also, can there be residency requirements? Well, I believe that we know there are residency requirements in public employment, and in particular in all public employment as well as criminal justice employment. So, and then there are specialized issues such as mistreatment, misuse of firearms in law enforcement, and the issue of whether or not there can be restrictions on things like moonlighting. Are there rights for public employees in criminal justice to have second jobs? And there are situations where that is allowed and not allowed, and you can read about them in Chapter 3. There's a lot of material. There are a lot of laws to consider. I hope you'll look over all of them and do your best to grasp what is important. Again, look at that first list of laws on page 50 and 51, and be sure to look at the terms at the end of the chapter to get a full sense of what's important in terms of legal rights and responsibilities for criminal justice employees. I hope you enjoy Module 3 and Chapter 3, and I look forward to working with you this week.